Welcome to the Climate Group's Demanding Net Zero Industry event at Climate Week NYC 2021. We're delighted that you can join us to hear from our panel of speakers on one of the most pressing issues in the fight against climate change, industrial transition. Long have industrial materials been the thorn in the side of global net zero ambitions. Total greenhouse gas emissions from the steel sector alone account for around 7% of global annual emissions. Industry needs to take urgent action for us to stand a chance in halving these global emissions by 2030, and the role of both supply and demand side companies will be vital in making this happen. But a shift is happening across the industrial sectors. No longer does decarbonisation seem impossible. Businesses and organisations across supply chains are working together to address the challenges of decarbonisation and to take accountability for joint carbon emissions. Breakthrough technologies are making decarbonisation a possibility for some of the hardest to abate industries. But business action is needed today to meet net zero targets by 2050. Inspired by this leadership, at the Climate Group we have worked with business to set up the Steel Zero initiative to drive the action that is needed. It brings together leading businesses and organisations that are committed to using 100% net zero steel by 2050. Steel Zero harnesses the collective purchasing power and influence of business to send a strong demand signal that aims to shift global markets and policies towards responsible production and sourcing of steel. Since we launched the initiative, Steel Zero has convened sector-based working groups that bring together members and other key players in the automotive, renewable energy and construction and property industries, building momentum for a global call to action to decarbonise the steel industry and encourage knowledge sharing across the steel value chain. And our Steel Zero membership is growing. Earlier this month, global ball bearing and seal manufacturer SKF joined Steel Zero and became a member of Responsible Steel, also our Steel Zero partner, further strengthening the demand for net zero steel. Today, in this event, we will explore why demand signals are critical, especially for the net zero transition for heavy industry. In our main panel discussion, we bring together key influencers from across the value chain to discuss the challenges and solutions in making and purchasing net zero steel. But to start our event, we begin by speaking with two leaders to discuss how industrialised sectors and harder to abate businesses can build on the progress and successes since Paris, what we need to see happen in the short term, and what actions these sectors need to take today to put us on a pathway to net zero. I'd now like to introduce and welcome Faustine de la Salle, Director of Energy Transition Commission and Co-Executive Director of the Mission Possible Partnership, and also Laurent Chokouali-Datou, Vice President Public Affairs at ICA, the International Copper Association. Faustine, perhaps we can start with you. The industrialised sectors have come a long way since COP21 in Paris. But what's driven the change and how do businesses continue to build on this success?
Look, I think two major things happened since the Paris Agreement. One critical milestone was the IPCC report in 2018 that really insisted on the fact that we needed to reach net zero emissions by around 2050 globally to stay well below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. And that just focused the minds, because if we need to reach net zero, no sector can escape that target. And so it forced a number of sectors that felt probably relatively safe before to ask themselves the questions of how they could drastically reduce their emissions, not just incrementally reduce their emissions. And then in parallel to that, what we've seen, and I hope that as the Energy Transitions Commission, we've played a role in that, is increasing evidence that that transition is feasible, that the technologies required to achieve net zero emissions across those sectors are either available or in the pipeline, and that financially this is something that the world can afford. So these were, I think, the two real drivers of change, which has then created a lot of momentum because policymakers, financial institutions, big corporate players have started looking into decarbonization, which has put increased pressure on the harder to abate sectors. And industry leaders have started now very seriously to take targets and to start investing, which is important. Targets without investments associated to them are wishful thinking. So what is really interesting is the number of industry leaders who are starting to very practically invest in the solutions that we need.
Mm-hmm. That's terrific. Thanks, Faustine. And Laurent, the same sort of question for you. I mean, what do you see as the key drivers of change, and how business can make further progress on this?
Thanks, Mike. Let me first define change such as I can observe it
Mm.
at the International Copper Association. And I relate to what Faustine just said about the 2018 IPCC report and the trigger that it created for a lot of the hard-to-abate industries. Certainly from the point of view of ICA members, what I observe is a growing trend to electrify their processes, moving to green electricity, in replacement for oil and gas whenever technically and economically feasible. That's a trend that I observe across practically all of our members. And what I also see is that the vast majority of them have embedded very clear sustainability commitments in their business plans. Whether it is, again, on the side of switching to renewable energy within the current decade by certain dates, so some are actually well ahead of the curve, already at 100% in 2021. Others are perhaps lagging behind, but will have committed to the switch by the end of the decade. And also a significant amount of investment projects either to deal with emissions and emissions abatement, or to also deal with the consequences of climate change. And I want to refer particularly to the issue of water management. Further down the supply chain, still in our association, you have members who've now developed sustainable offering of refined products based on recycled materials. Anyway, just to say, there are lots of different scenarios at play within our association, all demonstrating that we're on a path to addressing the issues as best we can. All of that has been, for the most part, voluntary, has to be said, but it's also in recognition and in response to the fact that meeting the challenges of the ESG agenda is increasingly a part and parcel of our members' license to operate. Certainly in the future, this is going to be a determining factor, and they're well aware of that. Is that enough? No, it's not. Clearly, we have a long way to go, but there should be no doubt about the ambition of our industry, certainly, to take its part and also to collaborate, because the collaboration frameworks are critical to achieving the goal that we're pursuing, net zero by 2050.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Laurent, that's very helpful. And it's interesting to hear your discussion of the progress that's been made, in a sense, from a voluntary perspective. And then also, Faustine, as you mentioned, policy as being one of the angles. I mentioned policy and investment as being critical of taking this forward. As we look a bit deeper at how we can accelerate the pace of change, I mean, maybe looking at that policy space, Faustine, are there sort of particular policy changes that you see as vital or critical to this shift we need?
We need a combination of policy mechanisms to make it happen. I think it's a complex space in which we're operating, and the industry space in particular is more complex than the power sector, for instance. We need a much broader portfolio of solutions to combine to help us reach net zero emissions. So in that context, we need policies that support innovation and support deployment. So not only the lab phase, but really the demonstration and then the first of a kind plans that need to be put up at an industrial scale. We also need mechanisms that establish price parity between high carbon solutions and low carbon solutions, where low carbon solutions today are generally more expensive in those sectors because we haven't reached the scale that we need yet, and therefore we haven't seen economies of scale. So that can be carbon pricing, but it can be different mechanisms like contracts for difference as well. And we need also mechanisms that incentivize buyers to ask for greener products, even if they're marginally more expensive. And that can be, for instance, CO2 intensity targets on automotives or on construction that then flows through the supply chains. So it's really a combination of mechanisms that we need. And I'd say the final layer that is really important is cooperation across nations, because most of the sectors we're talking about are global sectors that operate beyond national boundaries and that face a risk in terms of competitiveness. if they move in a region and other regions don't move and don't face the cost of decarbonization at the same pace. So we need forms of international cooperation in addition to the Paris Agreement that are really conceived on a sector by sector basis, bringing in the governments who matter for those sectors.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to hear you say that. We're very conscious with the initiatives we've been starting about the scale of the sectors for steel sector in China, the concrete and cement sector in India, and how we can work in depth at those countries, but also, as you say, bring together a global movement around that. Laurent, obviously you're focusing on a particular sector within this puzzle. Is there a particular policy angle on this that you see important, and how does that play out on the global perspective too?
Yeah, there are multiple policy angles actually, and I don't particularly want to get into one in particular. What I'd say is that what Faustine just said about scale and the diversity of situations that you find call for special forms of collaborations, and let's not be naive that prescribing a formula will work automatically. I mean, if we look at the copper sector particularly, we're not necessarily the most carbon intensive of industries, but we are, of course, carbon intensive. And there is a difference between what happens at the early stage of the chain and what happens then later down the track in the downstream. Triggering a coherent change across that chain is actually quite a significant endeavor and no small challenge in many ways. What we do is we're engaged in a structured dialogue with a variety of partners, ranging from our supply chain partners, of course, our constituents, and other mining organizations such as the International Council on Mining and Metals. We support initiatives such as the Initiative for Safer and Cleaner Vehicles, which is a value partnership, a value chain partnership with 28 OEMs to develop the next generation mining truck. And that, is actually bringing a solution to policymakers, if you will. If we create partnerships that guarantee the value chain is beyond an initiative and then come with a solution to discuss policy, we're in a better place to find a policy that is a win-win at the end of the day. So we're kind of looking at it from a very pragmatic point of view, knowing that our members at the end of the day are autonomous in the decision as to where they conduct their business and how they conduct it. But we're trying to coalesce certain initiatives in collaboration with value chain and other partners to bring about solutions. Talking about solutions, our association is facilitating a discussion around the creation, and this is what I think you were referring to as regards steel. We're embarked now in facilitating a discussion on creating a global roadmap for decarbonizing the copper sector. That's work in progress. The idea is to help frame and quantify realistic solutions and options across all three scopes of emissions that will act as a guide for the industry globally. And indeed, the supply chain, we're conducting it. We are the initiators, but we're trying to bring along the entire supply chain and all regions in that movement. By the way, this work is mirrored by an initiative conducted by the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, which is a separate project, but with which we're cooperating. All of them will come out, hopefully, in the early part of 2022, so we'll have opportunities to discuss this into more detail. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that we want to go to policymakers with solutions in order to, debate and hopefully arrive at solutions that are win-wins for everyone concerned.
Great. No, it's very good to hear that constructive approach, and we'll look forward to seeing that come out next year. Faustine, I wanted to just pick up on the word that Laurent used around collaboration. I mean, particularly given your role with the Mission Possible Partnership, I'd be interested to hear how you're seeing the mix of organisations that need to be involved in this and the way in which we can help to bring the value chain together to create change.
I think what Laurent was describing for the copper industry is very similar to what we've been undertaking under the Mission Possible Partnership for 7 of the harder to abate sectors. We're not covering copper at this stage, but we do cover steel and aluminium in similar value chains, but also transport sectors like aviation and shipping. And across all of those sectors, what we're really trying to do is do what Laurent was describing, bring the stakeholders who are critical to finding the solutions and into implementing the solutions to decarbonize those industries. So that includes miners in the metals value chain. It includes energy players, very importantly, because there's a complete shift in the energy system that needs to happen to serve those industries that are energy intensive. So when one industrial plant shifts to hydrogen or to electricity, it can really represent a major increment in terms of the energy supply required in terms of clean energy, but also the buyers that will require those materials or those mobility services, as well as the financial institutions who are increasingly committed to align their portfolios with climate principles, but are still in the process of figuring out what that means for the harder to abate sectors of the economy. So it's really by bringing all of those stakeholders together that we think that we can define a sector transition strategy, and we'll be launching a number of sector transition strategies just before COP that we've been building with industry players over the past 6 months, and launching a new series later on in 2022. But those sector transition strategies, as Laurent was saying, are the materials and the thinking we bring for dialogue with other stakeholders and in particular policymakers to then really anchor action in reality and ensure that all of the actions that different stakeholders across the value chain take are actually coherent with the direction of travel and with the level of ambition required over time to really meet our 2050 targets. So that combination of a strategy, full value chain collaboration, and tangible actions coherent with that strategy is what we're aiming for across all sectors in which we intervene. And it is both a challenging process because those stakeholders are not necessarily used to working with each other, but it's also a fun process, if I'm completely honest, because we're having discussions of equality and a richness with the diversity of stakeholders that we wouldn't have if we were operating in sectoral silos.
Super. Just as we draw to a close for this session, I'd like to just perhaps turn to each of you in turn and noting that we do know that with the economy growing and demand for low carbon materials and products is growing, and copper and steel and aluminium and a number of others are really critical parts of that change. Where do we need to be in? And I guess there's a sort of 12 months, 5 years, 2030 story, but perhaps just to say is what's the most important thing that needs to happen for us to be able to move forward urgently on this, given the pace that needs to happen to be ready for 2030? Laurent, perhaps your thoughts first.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to sound parochial perhaps a little bit, but given the central role that copper plays in the energy transition as a base metal, I think our industries need to be prepared to supply the additional demand in copper that other industries require and society demands, with a certified reporting of the associated carbon footprint. That has to become the norm eventually. But for our members, that means putting in place tracking systems, make sure they continue to innovate their processes and report on them. But to me, the ability to move to a green copper offering on a wide base is actually quite critical to the overall evolution of our industry. If I'm even more parochial, I will say I hope that an initiative we launched 2 years ago, which is a responsible production assurance scheme known as the Copper Mark, that will eventually make a move downstream. Right now it's focusing on upstream, but it will hopefully expand downstream. I hope that this is a success because that sort of connects with what I just said about the possibility, the wide-scale possibility of accessing responsibly produced copper and green copper. And then finally, I hope that the next few years entail an effective rollout of our in-the-making decarbonization roadmap with all the collaborations that Faustine was talking about. This is really what the next year's agenda entails for us.
Okay, Laurent, it's great to hear those specifics because I really think it's a number of very granular changes are clearly needed to be able to move forward this industry, and we can look big picture, but we also need to look in the specific places very closely. Faustine, your thoughts on what's most important in the next few months to year ahead?
They will echo what Laurent just said. For us, the next 12 months are really about ensuring that a maximum number of corporates have not only set targets for themselves for 2050, but most importantly for 2030, but that they are actively engaged in efforts where those value chain collaborations can happen. And obviously, the doors of the Mission Possible Partnership are wide open to the industry leaders who want to help us participate in that co-construction process. What we want to do over the next year is really do those sector transition strategy, those decarbonization strategies, so that we have the plan as soon as possible on how we're going to make this happen at a very granular level in terms of investments required, policy mechanisms required, level of carbon pricing required, etc., as well as demand required from key buyers across the value chains that are most using energy intensive materials and mobility services. And that lays the foundation for what I think needs to happen by 2025, which is very tangible investment. We're not at the time of speeches anymore. We need by 2025 to see plants up and running, ideally on an industrial scale, that already show us the technology function, that start helping us reduce the cost of those technologies, and that prepare the ground for fast deployment in the late 2020s and in the 2030s. And I'd say that the final bit that we really need in place pre-2030 are the policies that will enable us to push that deployment, because it won't happen by itself. Despite the leadership in all of those value chains, we will need policy mechanisms to support that transition. And it takes time to put policies in place. I come from the policy world. I know how tricky it can be to pass laws in different regions and in different countries. So we need to start now to ensure that those policy mechanisms are in place in 5 to 6 years.
If I may, Mike and Christine,
no, please, Laurent.
Coming from the policy world too, I'd say we should also think of the incentive power of policies in the innovation sphere. Because not all, I agree that many solutions are available, but certainly, as if I look at our sector, some solutions are yet to be invented, and the focus on the required research ought not to be forgotten.
No, that's a very helpful point, Laurent. No, it's very helpful. Thank you. No, I was just reflecting. It feels to me that this sort of the end of speeches, move to action is a very fitting. I mean, it's a bit of a strange message for Climate Week, where we have many speeches, but the whole message we have here is about getting it done. And this sort of story of how we can move forward in this next decade in action, policy, and some of the technology shift we need is going to be very important. That's really come across clearly, Faustine and Laurent. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing the insights you have on how we can decarbonize heavy industry. I'd now like to hand over. Great. Thank you very much, both. I'd now like to hand over to Anne-Claire Howard, the CEO of Responsible Steel, our Steel Zero partner, who'll be leading a conversation on building responsible relationships across zero carbon value chains from producer to procurer. Welcome, Anne-Claire.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Faustine and Laurent, for a great panel session. I'm very excited about our next panel. We're seeing a great shift happening in the steel industry. No longer does decarbonization seem impossible. We're seeing new technologies being scaled up. We're seeing companies investing in lower carbon production. Businesses and organizations across the steel supply chain are working together to address the challenge of decarbonization. We're seeing very interesting partnerships developing, for instance, between mining companies and steelmakers. We're seeing steelmakers and their end users working together as well. And this is a really interesting shift in the organization. Today, you can hardly open the papers without hearing about steel and climate change, and a discussion on the imperative need to decarbonize at speed. But I think what's interesting is it's no longer just a discussion, but it's about action and companies, individuals taking real steps toward decarbonization. The key thing to keep in mind is really that the path to decarbonization for steelmaking is a challenging one. It's also one which is very different depending on which region of the world you sit in and which assets you have. But I think the message is very clear. We're setting ambitions, net zero by 2050, and a lot of companies are making quite vocal statements about that. But 2050 is a long way away. and we need to act now if we want to be within a chance of reaching the Paris Agreement goals. So to talk about this with me today, and I'm really excited to introduce our panelists, I'm welcoming Kate Harris, who is the Group Head of Sustainability and Lend-Lease Foundation at Lend-Lease, Ralph Fitzner, the Global Head of Sustainability at Volkswagen, and Madhulika Sharma, who is the Chief Corporate Sustainability Officer at Tata Steel Limited. Welcome. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you today. I'm going to open with a difficult question, but I hope it'll be thought-provoking. The conversation on decarbonizing the steel industry has moved on very significantly since 2015 and the Paris Agreements. So in your opinion, how far has the industry come, and where can we hope hope for it to be in 2030? Kate, I'll start with you if that's okay.
That's fine. Thanks, Anne-Claire. Look, I think there's a real shift and a real momentum that we're seeing across the steel sector at the moment, which is really encouraging. At Lend-Lease, we established our net zero and an absolute zero carbon target last year. So we're looking to be net zero for our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2025. But more importantly for us was addressing scope 3 emissions. So we're targeting absolute zero. So no offsets, no excuses, absolute zero by 2040 for our scopes 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And for us, our scope 3 emissions include things like the embodied carbon in the materials that we use to construct buildings and cities around the world. So for us, it's been an important part of establishing these targets and kicking off our journey towards the targets to really address that elephant in the room for us around our scope 3 emissions. They're the ones we can't directly control but can influence, and that's why it's been exciting to engage through organisations like Responsible Steel and joining up to initiatives like Steel Zero to really have a seat at the table to look at the different roles that different parts of the supply chain within the steel sector can play. And we're seeing a real energy and momentum to collaborate up and down that supply chain and, as you said, drive that change at scale and at pace.
Thank you, Kate. And I look forward to discussing absolute zero maybe in a bit more detail further along the line. But Ralph, it'd be great to hear from you as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to second what Kate said. I mean, on our journey towards net carbon neutral by 2050, which is the ultimate goal of Volkswagen for our entire portfolio, obviously carbon neutral or fossil-free steel is a must in long term. And in terms of the conversation in the steel industry, it's great to see that we're now discussing also the hard to abate sector. And secondly, we're not only discussing, but we see momentum. If we look back for the last 5 years, I would say there have been rather small pilot projects in the industry so far. And for us as a large consumer, it was always difficult to see, okay, if there are tiny little pilot projects, this is not really moving the needle and helpful. And what we see now, also in line with the Fit for 55 plans of the European Union and the Green Deal, that basically looking at Europe, all major steel makers have made announcement to scale up hydrogen usage, using electrolyzers for green hydrogen and moving towards green steel. On the one hand, the incumbents. On the other hand, we see also new players coming up, such as H2 Green Steel in Sweden, where our truck business Scania is also partnering with. And they will come up at scale already by 2024, 2025. So this is good signs that it's not only a conversation that is moving, but actions that are moving.
Thanks, and that's a really positive note to continue on. Madhulika, as the steel representative here, what are your thoughts on how far we've come?
Thanks, Anne-Claire. I think two important sectors are represented before me. And I guess the steel sector, which I represent, is answer of many of their concerns regarding scope 3 emissions. But I'll say that certainly the sector has moved in last 5 years. If I look at COP21, the focus was more on the decarbonization of the power sector and the energy sector, and there was, of course, I think, minimal discussion on hard to abate sectors like steel. However, if I see in last at least 1 year, the discussions have certainly taken center stage for steel sector, primarily because steel is the most, I think, used commodity. It is part of many other sectors, and hence the supply chain itself makes it imperative to decarbonize so that it can help the other sectors. The other thing is that the technologies, I think, for the decarbonization, deep decarbonization, look within the site, however, not yet fully developed. Uh, but of course, what I would probably, how I look forward to 2030 is probably how we discuss the power sector. That the technologies are known. It's only the aspiration and ambition of the sector players on how quickly they traverse the trajectory. I guess for the steel sector, what I see is probably by 2030 the answers for this sector will be known, and it's only the aspiration and ambition of the sector players on how quickly they move on this trajectory. Of course, it will not happen on its own, and the demand for green steel, that's the first that's the first stimulus which the sector needs, because since it's a globally traded commodity, the prices are set by the global trade, and hence there has to be incentive for the sector players to actually invest very heavily into these deep decarbonization technologies, into the pilots and then the scale up, and hence the demand from customers is a big incentive. And of course, enforcing this demand or creating this ecosystem for this demand, and ensuring that the finances are available for the deep decarbonization, I guess the policies and are very, very important, and they play a very important role. And that is why if you see many steel players now in Korea or Japan have now come out with commitments in last, say, 6 to 8 months, after the countries have actually come out with the commitments, because now they have a guidance on how their country is going to take forward their commitments. And I guess that is the key moot point for all the and that is why the geography is a key. Geography in which you operate is, I think, also a very important part of the commitments that are being given by the players. So I'll leave it at that, Annie Claire, and more when we come to the next round.
Thank you, Madhulika, and you've actually touched on a very important point, and I'd love to get a sense from both Kate and Ralph on this. You've talked about the importance of demand signals and how critical it is for your buyers and consumers in general to be sending the right signals to steelmakers. You'd hope that the encouragement to decarbonize is there anyway, but obviously we're talking about a commercially traded commodity, so the numbers have to line up. Kate, in your opinion, how can we drive more demand for net zero steel, and how can your industry and Ralph's later support that trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of that momentum driver, and why we see sort of this tipping point as to where we've got the sector to at the moment. I think the demand side has woken up to the very important and critical role that we can all play in terms of sending a strong signal, both up and down the line. For us in the construction real estate sector, it's not only what we set as our own standards for procurement, but how we can also influence our customers and clients who maybe government or other private organisations looking to build and construct. So I think if we can give that certainty and that strong signal to steel manufacturers that we're going to be looking to specify and look to procure green steel product over regular steel, then I think that gives the certainty and confidence to steel manufacturers to actually invest then in terms of greening the process, the manufacturing, the steel plants, etc. So it's a really critical pathway, and I think that's what organisations like Responsible Steel and obviously the methodologies and standards that Responsible Steel are trying to drive for that common language around helping to drive the sector forward, but also Steel Zero in terms of bringing these players together up and down the supply chain to create these unlikely allies, to look at all the levers that we have a part in playing to help drive that momentum and create that really strong market demand signal.
Thank you, Kate. And Ralph, obviously you've already mentioned, your partnership with H2 Green and other steelmakers. So you're obviously sending some demand signals into the market, but what more can be done?
Yeah, let me put that demand signal and overall. I mean, we are aiming for decarbonization, and let put that into context of the automotive industry, because there are two answers to that question. On the one hand, if we look at the transformation of the industry, it's clear battery electric vehicles are the ultimate choice to decarbonize transport. And having said that, it also means that renewable energies are the key to drive down carbon emissions. And Madhulika mentioned that at COP21 we were much talking about the renewable energies. So this is still first and foremost the biggest lever for us to decarbonize transport, because we can more than halve the emissions over the life cycle by using renewable energies only for the use phase of a car. So 38 ton life cycle emissions from a Golf class car to 14. On the other hand, if we look at the pure supply chain, the materials only, their demand for green steel is an obvious choice because roughly 50 to 20% of the supply chain emissions of a typical passenger car come from the usage of today's steel. So it's 2.5 tons embedded carbon in a car. And from that point of view, it's obvious, and the automotive industry is one of the biggest users of steel across sectors. Driving demand is very important. And what we need is to basically also overcome that the chicken and egg problem, and also find solutions how to deal with a today existing green premium, which green steel as of today obviously has. So we probably might talk about instruments to overcome this a bit later. And then also how to find customer groups who are willing to pay a green premium as of today, or to find basically choices to bring green steel on par with today's steel.
Thanks, Ralph. And Madhulika, you mentioned obviously the importance of demand signals, but I'll give you an opportunity to talk about it maybe in more detail. From your perspective at Tata Steel, are you seeing these demand signals, and are they helping support your transformation as a company as well?
So I represent steelmaking in two very divergent, geographies. One is, of course, Europe, which is leading the whole transition. I'll say not only for steel, for every other sector, and also on the ambition and aspiration to actually deal with this problem. So I guess there are enough demand signals coming, and which is actually spurring the steelmakers to also, look for or up their ante on their decarbonization. So whether it is our Nemoidin plant, which is actually working and collaborating with a lot of partnerships across technology providers to actually look at a very deep decarbonization in next 10 years. But a large part of our operation is also in India, where again, as I said, the probably it's one of the only the G7 G20 countries which has not come out with a clear commitment on before this COP26 on how does the whole country actually looks at net zero. And I guess that's the issue, because and India is also going to be a growth market for steel. So as there is a need to build more infrastructure, as there is a need to look at the other requirements. So I guess that's a very difficult question, and that's a dilemma for leadership. That one, we have to put in new steel plants here in the country, and then which technology to actually adopt, because the technologies, near zero technologies, are not yet mature. The infrastructure required, for example, if you want to use hydrogen, I think the infrastructure for or the green energy required using so much of green hydrogen is not yet there. And if you have to actually protect your market share, and if you have to meet this domestic demand, then how do you which technology to adopt? That is one key question. The other is you have limited resources. Steel also is it's a cyclic industry. Of course, the industry is doing very well currently, but then with minimal resources, where do you invest your money, whether it's the deep decarbonization or transition of your existing assets, or it is the development of the new technologies, and which technology to adopt? So I guess these are very difficult questions, and that is why I made that point that policies actually are very important, because they give you the market signal. They give the signal not only to the steel producers, but also to the customers, to everyone in the ecosystem, to start working towards it in a coordinated manner. Hence, for one player in the sector in this kind of geography to say that I will now start doing something like this, which will actually increase your cost base, but there will be, as of now, there will not be a return. And then you also have your so many stakeholders, and how do you communicate to them on why are you doing this? That all becomes very key questions. And hence, I guess a clarity on where is the policy, I guess that really is the first thing. And now in India, we have started seeing some signals, though very weak, not as strong as the European markets. There are some, for example, the Mahindra Group in the country, they have adopted the science-based targets. So they also have an auto company within there. So they have, started asking on what is our decarbonization plan. But that's beyond that, we have not yet seen that they are ready to pay extra for, say, a greener steel kind of a thing. So this is where it is. And I guess that's the while everyone appreciates that the technology piece will be dealt largely by the steel players, I guess there are other very important levers which will actually lead to a deep decarbonization of this sector.
So you've mentioned the other two proverbial elephants in the room, which aren't sitting with us here today, but which are equally important, government and the finance sector, and the role that they have to play in supporting the transition. Numbers have been bandied around, like $4 trillion of investment needed to decarbonize the steel sector. These are so daunting that it makes it seem impossible. From your different perspectives, what is needed from government and investors to support this decarbonization? Madhulika, you've mentioned already quite a few in the case of India and comparing India and Europe together. But Kate, from your perspective, what is needed from government and the finance sector, and is it the same thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a few parts to that, I think, Anne Claire. I think both sectors again have a role to play in terms of helping to drive that demand signal that we all spoke about. I look at our investors within Lendlease and within our property funds under management, and they're a big part of the drive around us establishing such ambitious sustainability targets in the first place. The investor community are becoming much more savvy and sophisticated in terms of their demands of large corporates around these net zero and zero targets, etc., that we're seeing, come out into the market every other day of the week at the moment. So there's a big role to play in that, because I think once large corporates, regardless of which sector they're in, start to sort of set these sorts of standards and these sorts of ambitions, then it's about the action of actually delivering and executing against those standards. And for us in our various sectors here, obviously steel is a big part of that. The built environment is responsible for close to 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Steel, is accountable for about 8% of that. So it's a significant proportion, and it's a piece that, as I said up front, we felt we had a role to play in terms of at least influencing a positive outcome with regards to that component of our carbon footprint. So I think governments can set policy directives, can also be the client in procuring new cities, new buildings, new infrastructure that rely on steel, and can specify the use of green steel as a piece of their tendering process, and the investors can continue to drive that, I guess, governance aspect of ensuring that organisations that they're investing in that have a role to play with the steel sector also, setting reduction, decarbonisation targets and addressing steel as a component of that.
Ralph, I'll ask you the same question. What is needed from your perspective as an automotive company from government and your financiers? You've talked about costs already, so I'm sure that there are financial implications in there somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. And since steel is an obvious part of the cost of a car, and roughly 1 ton of steel in components in the car body fits in the steel, or you have aluminium-based concepts which are a bit more lightweight, but size is roughly similar. So on the one hand, if we look at our investors, I mean, they are coming up increasingly with ESG requirements, and first and foremost, decarbonization, being committed to the Paris Agreement, having science-based targets, which we do have on a 2-degree pathway. That's what the primary interest of the investors is. On the other hand, they also want to see reasonable margins and profits with their share investment, and therefore we also carefully have to deal with taking additional costs in our supply chains. But I would say the investment question is even more important for the steel industry as such. And let's be clear, decarbonizing steel is a massive systemic change and transformation requiring these trillions of investment and requiring also in parallel the build out of renewable energies, which is also not going fast enough even in Europe. So this is a massive transformation. On the one hand, so I would say we have to de-risk these investments for investors. And then it comes to politics and politicians, because we have to talk about the instruments that are appropriate to guide us through that transition. Carbon pricing, first and foremost, from our perspective, is a very important signal. So we have to have an ever increasing carbon price that brings green steel midterm on par with traditional steel making. There are additional concepts such as carbon contracts for difference, which the German government just proposed, which might be an interesting instrument to, at least for a shorter term of transformation, co-fund the green premium. That's another important aspect, easing these investments and de-risking these green steel investments for the investors. And last but not least, it's obvious that this can't be done in one region alone. So ideally, we should have that across regions, probably starting with G20 first. There will be different speeds of transformation, as Madhulika said. So the situation for steel industry in India is completely different than in Europe, which might be today a front runner, and the US. So that has to be taken into account as well.
Thanks, Ralph. And Madhulika, you've obviously already talked about how important it is to get the right signals from government and investors. But more specifically, in the case of India, what are you seeing as the necessary levers that need to be pulled for the transition to maybe accelerate?
Yeah. So, see, India is a developing economy, and I guess while there is at least the current regime, they want to. I think they have an aspiration to play a key role in this whole decarbonization, but we are also a democratic country, so you have a very large voter base which has got a very divergent thought process, and hence there has to be a equalizer kind of a thing, and hence I think personally a direct carbon price is not going to come in next 2-3 years in India. But of course, I think there are some signals. We also talk to other influencers that there are signals that they are open to use other levers like some public procurement policies or even some incentive schemes. So the government of India does have an incentive scheme for energy efficiency, which is called Perform, Achieve and Trade. They are thinking of increasing the ambit to carbon emissions so that players who are investing in improving their carbon emissions, they have an incentive to decarbonize, as well as on the other hand, to kind of create a small demand signal, create some public procurement policies, because again, government in India is a big buyer of steel. Most of the large infrastructure projects which are being taken up are being funded by government of India. So that, I think, these two things again will create some demand for at least for the players to uh, start investing into some of these lower carbon, or at least start taking these pilots and scale up, and also able to defend their investments, or diverging their funds towards these investments, or make up case for funding through sustainable funds some of these pilots. So I guess these are some of the things that we see happening in India in next 2-3 years. Not a direct carbon price, but yes, some other levers that will be played out.
So you've talked about the case of India, and obviously economic growth is associated to an increase in carbon emissions, but we're seeing that in a lot of businesses as well, where it's increasingly challenging to decouple, your growth as a business from your growth in your carbon footprint. What can be done to address that? And I'll start with you, Kate, because you have a challenge with steel, but also with a number of other commodities that go into buildings.
We do, that's true. Look, that is the challenge. So any large corporate that has sort of set themselves decarbonisation targets, net zero targets, absolute zero targets, the aim of the game is to try and decouple that business growth from your emissions growth. And so we're looking at all the solutions that are available today, and there are solutions available today, and certainly, net zero commitments and being able to procure offsets, etc., a part of the journey and part of the solutions available today, and they're an important stepping stone. For us, we do want to drive the agenda to one of absolute zero at the end of the day. We know if we're to stand a chance of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees, then we actually need to stop creating carbon emissions across our operations. And we've been quite public too in terms of putting out what are very ambitious carbon reduction targets of an absolute zero by 2040. We've been very open that we don't have all of the solutions today, and acknowledge the fact that because we've included our scope 3 emissions, such as the embodied carbon of the materials that we procure and use in construction, that we need to collaborate, and we need to start the conversation and the collaboration today with those important players across our supply chain if we're to stand a chance of creating the innovation and the change at scale and at pace that we need in order to not only meet our targets, but as I said, sort of play our part in a much bigger collaborative effort globally to try and limit global warming. So there's a lot at stake, and it is a challenge. But as I said, we're buoyed by the fact that we're seeing these sorts of signals from across our supply chain, not just steel, but cement and timber and a whole raft of other sectors, aluminium as well. And we know we have a responsibility and a role to play in sparking that conversation and looking at the role that we can play and the role we can support others in playing to create that change.
And I'll ask you the same question, Ralph. You also have a very complex supply chain. I always forget how many materials go into making a car, but especially an electric vehicle, but it's a lot, and I'm sure you can give us the accurate number. How do you decouple, your growth as a business and an industry from the potential of your increased carbon footprint?
Yeah, it's probably, well, it's hundreds of materials, and to give you an indication, we have approximately 60,000 suppliers worldwide, or even more. So it's massive and complex. But decoupling business growth from carbon emissions, I mean, I would not say it's an easy answer, but it's straightforward. It's by systems change. So to give you the example from moving from ICEs to battery electric vehicles. So as of today, over the life cycle, you save 25% of carbon emissions over the life cycle by buying battery electric vehicle, period. And this is at the European grid mix, which is in certain countries still relatively fossil fuel dominated. If you move to green energy, you cut those use phase emissions again in half. So by that systems change from ICEs to BEVs, you have that overall more than 60% cut in carbon emissions by technology change. So that's the biggest lever. I mean, it requires huge transformation, setting up new supply chains for the batteries, dealing with the sustainability challenges in the battery supply chains, making them more sustainable, driving our suppliers towards renewable energies and so forth. But that's the ultimate way. The second one is also thinking about new forms of usage, which might be, well, different if we're talking buildings, but if you take cars, I mean, single car ownership is one thing, shared usage is another one, ride sharing, ride pooling services. So investigating these new forms of mobility and investing in them, which we do with our ride pooling services, Moya with car sharing and so forth. That's another means to coming from the end customer's demand to decouple growth, economic growth from the resource consumption and from carbon emissions. And last but not least, since we can't do that alone, and I think we all agree, it's a cross-sectoral approach. For example, we founded the so-called CO Alliance for Europe's Recovery, Resilience and Reform together with the CEOs from utilities. We have H2 Green Steel in there. We have software companies such as SAP in Air Liquidrola and a couple of others who jointly also want to support the EU decarbonization agenda and also being a sparring partner for the European Commission in saying, okay, what do we need to make this huge transitions with a Green Deal a success? So it's also about public policy and outreach and advocacy for that transformation.
Thanks, Ralph. And I'm conscious that we're slowly nearing the end of our allocated time, but you've mentioned, Ralph, already the keyword. This is about systemic. It's about changing the entire systems in which we all operate. And I think we need to be realistic. Net zero steel is not going to happen tomorrow, certainly not at the scale that we require it. So, from your different perspectives, what are the key actions that we can take today, that the people listening to us today can take, when they go back and sit behind their desks and start thinking, what can I do? What can my industry do to accelerate this transition to net zero, or even better, to absolute zero? But let's stick to net zero for now. Kate, I'll let you kick us off on that challenging question.
Sure, thanks, Anne-Claire. Look, I think for me, it's start the conversation within your organisation around your own decarbonisation journey. Set your ambition and your targets high, and then look at the different global collaboratives that you can get involved in to really look at the different role that you can play as a part of the long supply chain that is steel. And groups like Responsible Steel, initiatives like Steel Zero are a great place to start to really declare your organisation's ambition and willingness to collaborate and innovate, and hopefully all work together and pull in the same direction to create that change at pace and at scale.
Thank you, Kate, and always good to get some words of encouragement that we can get there and we must get there. Madhulika, from your perspective, what can we do now?
So, yeah, I think Kate touched on it, but very important aspect is that, for making it all happen, first we must also, and as you said, the net zero is not going to happen tomorrow or even 10 years later. It's a journey, and it will take some time. But till that point of time, what do you call as a green steel? I think the definition of green steel and the standards become very, very important. Not only for the customers to actually buy the right, product, but also for the finances and the governments to actually say what classifies for investment. So I guess the one key role, I think that's where Responsible Steel and Steel Zero becomes very, very important in kind of shaping these standards and these frameworks and guidelines, which then becomes relevant for all the stakeholders of this particular sector to be on the same page in terms of understanding. So that can be done fairly quickly. And that's one thing I think very, very important. The other is, of course, Ralph mentioned it, that it's a multi, sectoral kind of a thing, and everyone wants the sector to do a deep decarbonization. And I guess the collaborations and partnerships become very, very important and very, very significant here. And hence, I think it's a common goal, and we need to work towards these kind of collaborations, which are as of now across the supply chain, to make the whole system work and go to the next level. So I guess these are two important things that we need to start looking at.
Thank you, Madhulika, and I think those are really important comments that you've just made. Ralph, since you will be the last man standing.
And by the way, a great sign of diversity being the unique man in this group. So that's also not very common in these conversations. Yeah, well, Madhulika rightfully said it won't happen overnight, but we have to, in order to make it happen the day after tomorrow, we have to act today, and this is what we are doing. So we're currently investigating for future car models which will come on the market in the second half of this decade, so around 2025, 2026. What is the implication of using green steel, and what will be the demand for specific car models? And then we're engaging with a number of suppliers in order to check, because the transformation in detail, it requires quality aspects, availability, scaling different alloys, qualities of steel. So it's not a very simple thing, but we have to work on this today, and this is what we do with our suppliers. This is what our Scania colleagues do with H2 Green Steel. So really helping driving the demand of a newly founded company, which has somehow the advantage not having a legacy business, so they can start greenfield. Sometimes this is really interesting. But to summarize, we have to act today, working on, in our case, which new car models could take green steel, what will be the additional cost. And as said before, we have to do that advocacy and jointly thinking about the appropriate instruments to finance the transition, be it carbon contracts for difference, be it ambitious carbon pricing, that at the end we have a business case and a de-risking for investors into green steel.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for those very wise closing words. I'm taking away a lot of things from this session. I've heard words like ambition, collaboration, adopting common definitions. But I think for me, what struck me the most is one, the momentum that there is right now across the entire steel value chain. We've been talking with mining companies that are looking to decarbonize their assets in order to satisfy their steel customers, who can then decarbonize theirs. And so it can trickle down through the value chain. And rarely have I seen in my short experience, I'm not that old, such collaboration across an entire value chain. And I think what I get from this and from this conversation is something quite rare when you talk about climate change, which is a sense of hope that there really is a momentum gathering, that the industry and its clients and its suppliers want to change, and that maybe for once we're in a position where the industry can be at the forefront of regulation and what governments require, but actually do more than what is asked for them by the governments and the countries that they sit in. And I think this is a really important change. And it does hopefully answer that question that you had, Ralph, which is around how do we achieve systemic change? Because this is about changing the entire system in which we operate. And I'm really thankful for your enlightening thoughts today, all three of you. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to the three of you. And I hope that for everyone who's been listening behind their computers or their tablets, that this has given them a sense of momentum, and that we can all embark on this journey together for the industry. So I want to thank all three of you for taking the time today, and I want to thank the Climate Group for organizing this panel session, which I hope has been useful and interesting for all of you. And on that note, I will hand over to Mike to continue this session for us. So thank you all three. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much to Anne-Claire for moderating that fascinating discussion. Thank you also to all of our other speakers that have joined us today and for the lively input into the discussions. Decarbonising heavy industry is the next frontier in tackling climate change. Businesses and governments need to take action now. It may be a difficult transition, but it's not impossible, and as we've heard from our speakers, change is already happening. Key players from across many heavy industries are setting ambitious net zero targets, and now is the time for others to join. We need businesses across all industrial sectors to examine their supply chains and start the transition towards net zero. This is crucial, not only for businesses to maintain a competitive advantage in their sector, but to address the climate crisis before it's too late. Please do visit the Climate Group website at theclimategroup.org for more information on Steel Zero, our members, and how you can become part of one of the first demand signal initiatives targeting the steel industry. Thank you then for joining us today at the Demanding Net Zero Industry event at Climate Week NYC. All of our speakers are available to contact following the event broadcast with any questions you may have. Please do contact us for more information on that. And enjoy the rest of the week.